That's what I was going to ask. So, welcome to the second session of our symposium on Nathan Brown's Rationalist Empiricism, a Theory of Speculative Critique. Rather than repeat my earlier remarks, I'll move right into introducing our two respondents. First, we'll have Alexi Kukuljevic. Alexi is an artist and philosopher based in Vienna, where he serves as lecturer in art theory at the University of Applied Arts. He's the author of a wonderful book, Liquidation World, on the Art of Living Absently, published in 2017 by MIT Press in their Short Circuit series. Alongside his philosophical work, Alexi's artistic practice has led him to exhibit at the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, the Kunsthalle Leipzig, the ICA in Philadelphia, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Ljubljana, and elsewhere. The second respondent will be Tracy McNulty. Tracy is professor of French and comparative literature and chair of comparative literature. That's right, Tracy, isn't it? They still have you, yes, chair of comparative literature at Cornell University. She's the author of two books, The Hostess, Hospitality, Femininity, and the Expropriation of Identity, which was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2007. Her most recent book, Wrestling with the Angel, Experiments in Symbolic Life, came out with Columbia Press in 2014. And she's completing a third book, Libertine Mathematics, Perversions of the Linguistic Turn. Following the responses, Nathan will have the opportunity to respond in turn. Then we'll open things up for Q&A, which can address both the specific topics that have come up in these responses and the responses from the previous session, as well as rationalist empiricism more generally. So with that, I will hand it over to Alexi.
Thanks so much, Rob, for the introduction and for also inviting me to this event. I mean, it's wonderful to be here. I met you. I also met Nathan, also Audrey at Ithaca so many years ago when this book had its genesis. So it's wonderful now to actually really have a chance to engage it, in its final form, but also to see the, its incarnations along the way. So it's a genuine pleasure. Let me just begin then. And I think my remarks will be, around 22 minutes. So, within the 20-minute framework with a little excess. So rationalist empiricism, the book, attests to the lived practice of what it means to philosophize. In a banal sense, this is perhaps true of every book of philosophy. However, this book sets itself apart by foregrounding the dissonance, the noise that is all too often silenced as one's experience of the world enters into philosophical systematicity. The book ends on a beautiful note in which we are left suspended between wonder and the uncanny. I quote, "How strange it is to be anything at all." Rationalist empiricism is itself an effort to sustain the strangeness of being by attending to the force of philosophical estrangement that dissipates as one becomes comfortable with the conceptual machinery of a philosophical system. The book proposes to amplify the experience of discomfort by marshalling the gap between philosophical systems, between rationalism and empiricism, and more fundamentally, between idealism and materialism. Rationalist empiricism is an operation of philosophical estrangement that highlights the requisite violence of the concept as a force of exteriorization that ruptures the demands and standards of common sense. As the young Hegel himself suggested in Über das Wesen der philosophischen Kritik überhaupt, on the essence of philosophical critique as such, philosophy by its very nature is esoteric. For itself, it is neither made for the masses, nor is it susceptible of being cooked up for them. It is philosophy only because it goes exactly contrary to the understanding, and thus even more so to sound common sense, the so-called healthy human understanding, which actually means the local and temporary vision of some limited generation of human beings. To that generation, the world of philosophy is in and for itself a topsy-turvy world, an inverted world, end of quote. Rationalist empiricism is an effort to forestall the naturalization of this inversion by unsettling the methodological unity of the tradition, by constructing a framework, what Brown terms a strange topology, in which incompatible systems enter into communication. The practice of thought itself comes to be defined by an internal disruption in which its own exteriority is encountered in and through the exceptions produced by an encounter with the outside. To come to terms with the world in which we live, it does not suffice to simply interpret the world through a particular philosophical system, for thinking occurs only at the seams of the systems themselves and the impossible place of the thinking subject summoned to sustain their dissonant relation. And I quote Nathan here, "What is the world that we pass through at the crux of concept and experience when we do so? Where is the extra systematic space of philosophical reflection or of thought in which we think the compossibility or communication of philosophical systems? Where and what is the world we recompose as we do so?" Such questions haunt the book as a whole and can only be sustained by a philosophical approach that shifts the problem of philosophy away from a desire for either methodological unity or systematicity in order to attend to what Brown calls the methodological gap between rationalism and empiricism. This gap, which is itself produced by the theoretical practice of rationalist empiricism, is the concern of speculative critique. The production of this gap between systems enables the determination of a gap in the real that thwarts systematicity itself. Reason interrupts experience through conceptual determination, but it is in turn interrupted by an encounter with that which is exterior both to thought and experience. This exteriority is neither empirical nor rational and can only be thought through the determination of what is non-empirical in the empirical, the rationalist empiricism of scientific practice, and what is non-rational in reason, the rationalist empiricism of philosophical practice. Rationalist empiricism, Brown writes, is an orientation toward the outside of experience and the outside of thought, and it unfolds on the outside of method. Philosophy is, as Hegel insists, esoteric by its very nature. But nothing less is required if one is to think with Brown the rationality of the real without positing that the real is rational. It is the theory of the interruption of speculative identity that is at issue in speculative critique. For the rationalist empiricists, the real is without reason because it is absolutely contingent. The determination of the absolute restores reason's speculative vocation, but the speculative proposition thus generated necessitates division, not unification. Contingency itself is doubtless the central concept of the book. It traverses Brown's treatment of politics, quote, "Adequate knowledge of capital is precisely knowledge of its historical contingency." His treatment of the aesthetic, "To stumble upon a singular unity of matter, life, and thought in the element of feeling, and to experience this feeling as the implicit inscription of a statement, this is beautiful." His treatment of science, quote, "The qualitative particularity of experimental procedures remains ineradicable," and ontology. Brown argues that to think in the wake of finitude, following the work of Quentin Meillassoux, requires the reformulation of the problem of the ontological difference, where the being of beings is thought as absolute contingency. Rationalist empiricism thus implies a critique of Kant's critical effort, and by extension, transcendental philosophy tout court, to save necessity from the contingent vicissitudes of the empirical. The book is in large part inspired by Meillassoux' intervention, whose philosophical practice for Brown is itself an exemplary model of the methodological unorthodoxy of rationalist empiricism. Whereas the reception of Meillassoux' work has been determined by his critique of correlationism, Brown emphasizes that this critique by no means gives license to simply hawk the resurrection of metaphysics. On the contrary, Brown positions Meillassoux as the inheritor of Hegel's immanent critique of Kant, Althusser's immanent critique of Marx, and Heidegger's immanent critique of Hegel. To borrow Deleuze's formula for Nietzsche's relation to Kant, we can say that for Brown, Meillassoux' critique of transcendental philosophy is the realization of the very project of immanent critique inaugurated by the critique of pure reason. The import of Meillassoux for Brown lies in his critique of the subordination of science to philosophy, and by extension, his critique of the problem of ground and the principle of sufficient reason. Reason need not limit its scope methodologically in advance, restricting itself to the field of possible experience, since the encounter with the contingency of the actual engenders reason through the very act in which it determines its absolute necessity. The rationalist empiricist draws the rational from the empirical. Kant's critical exit from the battleground of metaphysics leaps over the problem of contingency, the facticity of being. Rationalist empiricism returns to the battleground, not in order to reinstall thought within the element of pre-critical naivete, but to restore critique itself to the fundamental antagonism that engendered its image of thought. Put differently, rationalist empiricism extracts the problem of critique from its Kantian transcendental solution. To this purpose, Brown forcefully returns us to the primal scene of critical philosophy, to Kant's encounter with the thought of David Hume. By bringing the full pressure of the empiria to bear on the concept of causality, what Kant in the Prolegomena terms the crux metaphysicorum, Hume exposes that the dream of metaphysics, that is the a priori determination of being, has indeed been nothing but a dream, a dogmatic slumber. By imperiling the concept of causal necessity, Hume's problem of induction threatens the very edifice of reason itself, since it calls into question its very foundation, its fundamental ground. If metaphysics consists wholly and completely of a priori statements, and the a priori has no relation to and thus no bearing on experience, then metaphysics and by extension, science as such is merely fictitious, a game that may operate with logical consistency, but that is in principle untouched by the real and whose provenance owes more to the imagination, to what Hume terms fancy, than to the logos. The problem with dogmatism is not a matter of its inconsistency. A dogma may indeed be logically valid, fully compliant with the principle of non-contradiction, but nonetheless be without ground. Hume's problematic concept of cause, as Kant terms it, forces a rupture at the heart of metaphysics and thus of reason between the principle of non-contradiction and the principle of ground. Kantian critique is the registration of this event in thought. The principle of ground, also known as the principle of sufficient reason, states that nothing is without reason. Empiricism, precisely because it claims that something is without reason, exposes a fundamental division within reason itself between the demand of logical consistency, logical grounds, and what Kant on one occasion termed the problem of real ground, and what will become the problem of the a priori condition of possible experience in the Critique of Pure Reason. Hume exposes a gap in the logos itself between its operation and its meaning or sense. And it is this gap that Kantian critique attempts to close by attempting to ground logical judgment. The practice of rationalist empiricism entails reopening this gap. The issue is not a matter of becoming Humean, since Hume does not make of the problem of induction what he ought. But one can think what remains unthought in Hume by attending to the shudder it doubtless induced in the thought of Kant. To do so requires that we at once recognize that Kant thought what he thought he must in order to preserve the real ground of reason from the contingency of the empiria, while discerning that he need not have. Although undertaken in the name of science, the effort to render congruent scientific objectivity with perceptual objectivity betrays a lingering commitment in Kant to sound common sense, to healthy human understanding. This is perhaps most strikingly evident in Kant's treatment of the synthesis of reproduction in the imagination from the addition of the deduction of the pure concepts of the understanding in the Critique of Pure Reason. Kant argues that without a law prescribing the necessary connection between appearances, the empirical imagination would be without rule, and its very capacity for representation would be dead and unknown to us, a capacity buried and hidden in the recesses of the mind. And I quote Kant here: "If cinnabar were now red, now black, now light, now heavy, if a human being were now changed into this animal shape, now into that one, if on the longest day the land were covered with fruits, now with ice and snow, then my empirical imagination would never even get the opportunity to think of heavy cinnabar on the occasion of the representation of the color red. Or if a certain word were attributed now to this thing, now to that, or if one and the same thing were sometimes called this, sometimes that, without the governance of a certain rule to which the appearances are already subjected in themselves, then no empirical synthesis of reproduction could take place." End of quote. Such a situation seems to Kant unimaginable. If these are the consequences of a truly consistent empiricism, this is more than enough for Kant to render it dangerously absurd. Yet thought need not take its guide from such human, all too human imperatives. That is, we do not have to think what Kant says we must think, Brown writes. In fact, there is no reason to think it. To think the fact that Kant need not have thought what he thought he must is to lodge contingency at the heart of thought and of its history, and thus to restore the import of Hume as the figure who forces reason to come to grips with the contingency not only of the objects of thought, but of thought's own occurrence. Reason is not thwarted by this encounter, but engendered by the demand to think contingency. There is no reason to think it. If it so happens that it is thought, however, this itself is contingent. What is not contingent, according to Meillassoux and Brown, however, is contingency itself. Contingency is the sole necessity. Meillassoux terms this the principle of factuality. The principle is established on the basis of the peculiarity of this singular judgment. For to say that contingency is contingent is in fact to say the same thing as the assertion of its opposite. Contingency is not contingent, which is to say, necessary. The obliteration of its sense is its sole sense. It asserts an indifference to its own negation. Interestingly, the negation does not call into question its identity, but truly expresses it. It is the very thing it is not. Here we have a speculative proposition that is truly without ground, for it separates what it says, contingency is, from sense. Contingency is not contingent in its very saying. Contingency is necessary. The determination of contingency absolves it from sense, from its sense. It is absolute, and I am tempted to say, thinking with Brown, that it says its own nonsense. Meillassoux himself speaks of the impossibility of its sense being redoubled. And I'm quoting Nathan quoting Meillassoux here. This non-redoubling reveals the origin of every necessary statement. A necessary statement has as its object not a being, but the contingency of beings. Now, the very fact that this has been thought does not entail the necessity of its having been thought. The determination of the necessity of contingency does not imply the necessity of thinking. Quote, the contingency of thought cannot depend upon the thought of contingency. That's Meillassoux. To think it requires the exteriorization of what is thought, the necessity of contingency, from the contingent act of its being thought. Its necessity implies no necessity except that that of its contingency. The in itself that is here rationally determined, Brown stresses, does not imply that we can, and I'm quoting Brown, can think anything like the appearance of the world as it would be without the phenomenal determinations of thinking and sensing beings. Meillassoux claims that thinking the non-contingency of contingency forces a determination of the in itself with no bearing whatsoever upon the appearance of the world or our existence within it. The very contingency of our own thought must be conceived as a determination of being and not only a determination of thinking. End of quote. The given is thought as contingent only in the determining act that separates the given from any givenness. The in itself being is non-manifest. Thinking is at once adequate to what is being thought, the being of beings, and this adequation includes the non-identity of being and thought. Being is not the ground of appearance, nor is thought. Rather, being is thought as the separation of being from sense, from meaning. Thinking is the separation of being and appearance, as Plato had proposed long ago, but what is thought as separate is becoming in itself, infinite because unconstrained by any law other than the necessity of the contingency of law as such. Rationalist empiricism provides us a new image of what it means to overturn Platonism. It carries out this inversion of Plato through recasting Heidegger's thought of the ontological difference. For Brown, the question of being cannot, however, be posed in the manner Heidegger proposed. What is the meaning of being? What does being signify? Being thought as absolute contingency, what Meillassoux terms unsubordinated contingency, does not make possible and hence ground the meaning or sense of beings. Its event rather serves to separate being from all sense. Brown thus highlights a crucial tension in Heidegger's Being and Time, in which Heidegger determines the temporality of time, not in terms of Dasein's own ecstasis, but as, and he quotes Heidegger here, the primordial outside of itself, in and for itself. I sadly cannot develop here the significance of Brown's interpretation of Heidegger, the latter's relation to Meillassoux, and their respective relations to Hegel. However, I want to simply highlight that Brown here has marked in the fabric of Being and Time a certain exception that exceeds the limits of its framework, and that forces us to call into question the very integrity of the book's otherwise pristine methodological coherence. It is something that a thinker stumbles upon, quote, as a punctual, a-successive rupture, breaking with the existing order of succession, with the previous rule of succession. The question of the contingency or necessity of succession, Hume's question, is, in my view, the fundamental question of rationalist empiricism. And I quote Nathan here, is there a reason the future should continue to resemble the past? The rationalist empiricist answers no. And the book is an elegant and rigorous effort to dignify this negation. This negation is only dignified if it is not affirmed at the cost of ontology, that is, at the cost of the logos. And I quote Nathan here, insofar as ontology is a rational discourse, it is constrained, conditioned by what has to be said of being. It cannot just say anything, and insofar as it is not a dogmatic discourse, but rather imminently critical, ontology has to unfold across the reflexive experience of what happens in thought. The book would itself be a farce if Brown himself did not say what he thought he must. And yet the reader cannot do justice to the book without registering what happened in the course of this thought and thus consigning it to its irreparable contingency. And it is a sign of the coherence of its methodological asystematicity that Brown does not attempt a synthesis and thus to ground the relation between the contingency of thought's historical occurrence and the ontological determination of the absolute. Only by leaving this gap open can Brown conceive of a history as necessarily contingent and thus open to contestation. The book as a whole suggests that only by bringing the full force of reason to bear on the contingent are we able to see the truly contingent. And as the methodological reflections of the book make clear, this is not to ensure that thought proceeds without stumbling. This is no discourse on method. Rather, it hopes to provide a means of differentiating between a genuine trip and a mere pratfall. The book ends with a certain encomium to Kant's treatment of the beautiful, and this is no doubt fitting, for it is here that Kant, in his final effort to provide some ground for the unity of reason, introduces perhaps his most stellar exception, a judgment whose singularity is defined by its very exception, by the exposure of reason to the rule of the contingent. Thank you.
Thanks. And with that, I'll hand it over to Tracy.
Right. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for organizing this event, Rob. Thanks, Nathan, for this tour de force book. I feel like I'm only just beginning to absorb the argument and some of its implications, but I feel like it's already opened a lot of horizons for me. I have to apologize in advance for the fact that my response is probably going to be the most oddball, or in any case, the most tangential of the four, but I think that also speaks to the incredible range of different fields and domains that Nathan's work is touching upon, just like the previous three responses. So I'd like to begin with the quotation that serves as an epigraph to your book from Bachelar's The Philosophy of No. Empiricism and rationalism are bound in scientific thought by a strange bond, as strong as that which unites pleasure and pain. This enigmatic formulation naturally piqued my interest, so I was pleased to see you return to it in the conclusion to the book, where you approach it as a riddle that demands a solution. You offer that the bond that unites pleasure and pain must be life. This passage appears in the midst of a short reading of two works by Michel Henry, The Essence of Manifestation and The Genealogy of Psychoanalysis. For Henry, life is synonymous with the immediacy of autoaffection. It is also the necessary condition of all thinking, since he understands every possible form of thought, representation, or perception to be conditioned by sensation. Returning to Bachelar's riddle, you then ask, what bond could be as strong as the bond of life itself? Your answer, of course, is technics, which enables new configurations of experience, for example, recording, that project thought outside of its synthesis with lived immediacy. You write, if rationalism and empiricism are bound in scientific thought by a bond as strong as this, could it be precisely that which is not life, technics? This is indeed a strange bond, for technics separates reason and experience, the better to enable the non-immediacy of their coordination. Yet it also embodies reason and experience. Technology is the material instantiation and the record of their historical transformation, just as it becomes a condition of possibility for the historical transformation of their relationship, for what can be thought, for what can be experienced. What distinguishes science from life, technics, is what constitutes the strange bond of rationalism and empiricism in scientific thought. If this bond is as strong as that which unites pleasure and pain, life, the immediacy of autoaffection, that is because it is capable of displacing it, of propelling scientific thought beyond the determinations and indeed the existence of life. In the book, you make clear that what you call technics is not limited to technology and its different iterations, but includes writing and techniques of inscription more generally, all of which underscore the exteriority of thought to life. You read the as strong as of Bachelar's analogy, not as a statement of equivalence, therefore, but as positing two bonds of equal strength but opposed effects. Well, I'm very persuaded by your reasoning here, and especially by your account of techniques as affecting this unity and separation. I don't really buy it as a gloss of Bachelar's evocation of the strange bond as strong as that uniting pleasure and pain. This is because while life may indeed include pleasure and pain, or involve the experience of these sensations, it does not unite them, at least not in the immediacy of autoaffection. As sensations, pleasure and pain can only be experienced as opposed, if not mutually exclusive. They certainly do not constitute a unity from the vantage of immediate sensory experience. To understand them as united, as bound, we would at the very least require a theory of the unconscious and a fantasy, neither of which belong to the sphere of autoaffection. I must admit that when I think about what unites pleasure and pain, what comes to mind for me is not life, but the pleasure principle, and above all, its beyond. This association is hopefully not as gratuitous as it sounds, since it raises fundamental methodological questions that I think are not without relevance to your account of rationalist empiricism. I'm thinking in particular of Deleuze's meditations on Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which examine the challenge it presents to any experiential or sensory investigation of pain and pleasure. He understands Freud's account of the death drive as the beyond of the pleasure principle, as a foray into speculative philosophy, an attempt to identify the foundation or law of the pleasure principle, the supersensual law of its sensual manifestations. And I'll read this longish quote from Deleuze. Of all the writings of Freud, the masterpiece we know as Beyond the Pleasure Principle is perhaps the one where he engaged most directly, and how penetratingly, in specifically philosophical reflection. Philosophical reflection should be understood as transcendental, that is to say, concerned with a particular kind of investigation of the question of principles. It soon becomes apparent in Beyond the Pleasure Principle that Freud is not really preoccupied with exceptions to that principle. They are not what he means by the beyond of the title. All the apparent exceptions which he considers are treated by Freud as merely apparent exceptions, which could still be reconciled with the pleasure principle. In other words, there are no exceptions. At this point, we need to resort to philosophical reflection. What we call a principle or a law is, in the first place, that which governs a particular field. It is in this sense that we speak of an empirical principle or a law. Thus, we say that the pleasure principle governs life universally and without exception. But there is another and quite distinct question, namely, in virtue of what is a field governed by a principle? There must be a principle of another kind, a second order principle, which accounts for the necessary compliance of the field with the empirical principle. It is the second order principle that we call transcendental. Pleasure is a principle insofar as it governs our psychic life. But we must still ask, what is the highest authority which subjects our psychic life to the dominance of this principle? Already Hume had remarked that though psychic life clearly exhibits and distinguishes between pleasures and pains, we could never, no matter how exhaustively we examined our ideas of pain and pleasure, derive from them a principle in accordance with which we seek pleasure and avoid pain. We find Freud saying much the same. We continually encounter pleasures and pains in psychic life, but they are found scattered here and there in a free state, unbound. That the pleasure principle should nevertheless be so organized that we systematically seek pleasure and avoid pain makes it imperative that we should look for a higher type of explanation. In virtue of what higher connection, what binding power, is pleasure a principle with the dominance that it has? Freud's problem, we might say, is the very opposite of what it is often supposed to be. For he is concerned not with the exceptions to the principle, but with its foundation. His problem is a transcendental one, a problem, as Freud puts it, for speculation. Right? And the reference here is to the famous first words of Beyond the Pleasure Principle. What follows is pure speculation. Freud's answer, Deleuze continues, is that the binding of excitation alone makes it resolvable into pleasure, that is to say, makes discharge possible. It is the binding process which makes pleasure as the principle of mental life possible. Why am I mentioning this? Because to affirm that pleasure and pain are united by the immediacy of life as autoaffection, I believe, is to dismiss as self-evident the very problem that Deleuze describes here as calling out for philosophical reflection, and is requiring, I believe, precisely what you describe as a retroaction of thought upon life. Deleuze frames the bond uniting pleasure and pain as a problem for what he calls transcendental philosophy, for what Freud calls speculation, and for what I will suggest might be called, following the lines of inquiry your book has opened up, a rationalist empiricism. The question it raises is, how do we go about investigating this beyond? What allows it to be thought? Initially, Freud thinks of the death drive as a drive to destruction or dissolution, whose clearest manifestation might be sadism. He posits that in addition to the instinct to preserve living substance and to join it into ever larger units, the province of the life drives, or eros, there must exist another contrary drive seeking to dissolve those units and bring them back to their primeval inorganic state, the death drive. Their concurrent or mutually opposing action would then explain the phenomena of life. So on that first approach, pleasure and pain would in fact be internal to life, right? Eventually though, Freud realizes that the attempt to isolate the death drive or make manifest its operation runs up against an impasse. While a portion of the death drive becomes visible in sadism, coming to light as a drive to aggressivity and destruction, it is perceptible only on the condition of being, quote, pressed into the service of eros, and therefore presented in the already compromised form of an impure alloy or compound. Moreover, he now understands destructiveness not as a manifestation of the death drive, but as a form of defense against the primary processes, and thus as a mode of cathexis. The death drive as such is not an object of empirical investigation. Freud now stresses that this substantialization of the death drive tends to obscure a more profound understanding of the drive as immaterial, as not given, and therefore thinkable only in speculative terms, as a formal or mythical construction. In Deleuze's gloss, when we speak of the death drive, we refer to thanatos, the absolute negation. Thanatos as such cannot be given in psychic life, even in the unconscious. It is, as Freud pointed out in his admirable text, essentially silent. And yet we must speak of it, for it is a determinable principle, the foundation, and even more, of psychic life. What is required is therefore an investigation of the primary processes, which are not themselves accessible to experience. And interestingly, one of the forms that takes in Freud's own work is the abandonment of the energetic model and of the thermodynamic paradigm more generally in favor of something more like a mathematical model. Jacques Derrida in Freud and the Scene of Writing offers one of the most influential treatments of this problem, one that seems especially pertinent to your book's argument, in as much as it makes central the role of technics and inscription in exploring this absolute negation. He examines how Freud's treatment of inscription and his discussion of the mystic writing pad in particular enables both a non-logocentric treatment of writing that unfolds outside of autoaffectivity and an exteriorization of thought. And I'd be glad to hear your views on this, since I imagine that argument must at the very least be kind of in the background of your argument. But Deleuze also offers a novel contribution to this vein of thought when he proposes that disavowal is a speculative method that allows for a thinking of primary nature, and with it the death drive, precisely as ungiven. He writes, "It might seem that a disavowal is, generally speaking, much more superficial than a negation or even a partial destruction. But this is not so, for it represents an entirely different operation. Disavowal should perhaps be understood as the point of departure of an operation that consists neither in negating nor even in destroying, but rather in radically contesting the validity of that which is. It suspends or neutralizes the given in such a way that a new horizon opens up beyond the given and in place of it." What Deleuze underscores in disavowal is the problem of construction, or the real that disavowal makes available to thought beyond what it refuses or denies. This construction is not sensuous, but linked to the purely mental sphere of imagination and myth. The method of disavowal is central to masochism, which is concerned with what Deleuze calls the divine latency of the death drive, the primary processes as uncathected or unbound, a pure potential not discharged in action, destruction, or in sensation, pleasure and pain. Deleuze contends that masochism can be defined neither as erotogenic and sensuous, pleasure, pain, nor as moral and sentimental, guilt, punishment. Instead, masochism is above all formal and dramatic, since its particular pleasure-pain complex is determined by a particular kind of formalism. It is expressed thematically by the ideal of coldness, which in freezing the warmth of sensuality allows the severity of primary nature to emerge. Yet this pursuit of the supersensual realm of primary nature depends not only on the method of disavowal, but on the technique of the fetish. Deleuze understands the function of the fetish not as a compensation for what the mother lacks, but as a support for this supersensual ideal. He proposes that the fetish, and more specifically the freezing of time it affects, allows for the construction and formalization of primary nature, right? So while Deleuze's reading of the fetish is, I think, very idiosyncratic and specific to him, it also draws upon something in Freud's own analysis. Freud himself describes the fetish as the support for an idea. He observes that the fetishist's refusal of the mother's castration actually involves two distinct operations. If we wish to differentiate between what happens to the idea as distinct from the affect, he writes, we can restrict repression, Verdrängung, to relate to the affect. The correct word for what happens to the idea is then disavowal, Verleugnung. Repression concerns affect, namely the castration anxiety provoked by the sight of the female genitals. Conversely, the idea at stake in disavowal is not castration anxiety or even the perception of the mother as castrated, but rather the reality of the maternal phallus. In other words, disavowal does not merely deny castration, but posits or upholds the reality of an object whose existence cannot be perceived. The point is not merely that an expected object, the penis, is found to be lacking, but rather that a new object, a non-empirical object, is forced into reality by means of the fetish as a process or a thing. In other words, the mere existence of the fetish as a man-made thing or object attests to the realness of the maternal phallus it figures by offering itself as a plastic support for that unconscious idea. Freud shows that the fetish both sustains and exteriorizes the unconscious idea that has been negated by the evidence of the senses. He emphasizes that the fetishist does not fail to perceive the mother's lack of a penis, of which he is perfectly conscious. Instead, two distinct and incompatible realities come to exist side by side. The perceptual reality, in which the child knows that the mother has no penis, and a psychic reality upheld by the fetish, in which the maternal phallus reigns supreme. Freud writes, it is not true that the child emerges from his experience of seeing the female parts with an unchanged belief in the woman having a phallus. He retains this belief, but he also gives it up. During the conflict between the dead weight of the unwelcome perception and the force of the opposite wish, a compromise is constructed such as is only possible in the realm of unconscious modes of thought, the primary processes. In the world of psychic reality, the woman still has a penis in spite of all, but this penis is no longer the same as it once was. Something else has taken its place, has been appointed its successor, so to speak, and now absorbs all the interests which formerly belonged to the penis. In the terms of your argument about techniques, I would suggest that the fetish is an object, a technology, or a practice that allows for the exteriorization of thought, for something that exceeds and interrupts the autoaffectivity of self-experience. It enables a writing of the primary processes that are inaccessible to consciousness and experience. Disavowal can also make use of other technologies and practices. In Deleuze's own reading, photography is one of the best examples of this technique. It freezes movement, it suspends the spontaneity of second nature, such that the cold mother of primary nature, an ideal with no sensual existence, can be glimpsed in and through the gestures and attitudes of the real woman who becomes her fetishistic support. In sum, then, here what I see as the main contributions of Deleuze's intervention on the pleasure principle and its beyond. First, Freud has a speculative method, and it arises out of the difficulty of uniting pleasure and pain, which necessitates a transcendental principle that would explain their non-intuitive coordination. Second, the masochist disavowal of secondary nature, of the sensations of pleasure and pain, is a speculative method that opens up a new horizon beyond the given and in place of it through a retroaction of thought upon life. And third, the fabrication or staging of the fetish is the techniques that enables the exteriorization of this thought that is inaccessible to experience or sense perception. What is so unique about Deleuze's way of proceeding, and in my opinion distinguishes him from virtually every other philosophical reader of Freud, is that he depsychologizes the logic of disavowal and the practice of the fetish, extracting them from the sphere of autoaffection and isolating disavowal as a method that allows for a construction of primary nature, one that he even goes so far as to associate with Platonic idealism. What if this divided attitude, this disavowal, were itself the bond uniting not only pleasure and pain, in as much as both would be disavowed in favor of a supersensuous idea, but also, at least in some of its iterations, rationalism and empiricism. As a reading of the Bachelard quote with which I began, perhaps this would suggest that the binding force that is as strong as that binding pleasure and pain is not an equal and opposite force, as in your reading, where technics would supplant life, but the same unbinding bond, a technics that enables a retroaction of thought on life that interrupts its spontaneity and autoaffection. I see a number of affinities here between the questions I'm trying to raise through Deleuze and your own treatment of the techniques of prehension in the photography of Nicolas Bayer, which I find to be one of the most extraordinary chapters in the book. I'm thinking in particular of your discussion of Project Star Black, the installation whose component pieces all explore in different ways the properties of an object, in this case, a meteorite, that no longer exists at the end of that process because it is eventually ground into powder and used to paint a canvas. You show that even as that object ceases to exist, its primary properties are made manifest and shown to cohere across the different presentations of the object through the elaborate technical processes of digital scanning, 3D printing, and manual craft that Bayer employs. In a wonderful formulation, you state that, quote, the object nowhere exists, but has become the coherence of its technical construction. In one example, the sensuous object produced by 3D printing, a massive reconstruction of the meteorite based on digital scans of its surface, actually supports or bodies forth the primary properties of the object that are apprehended rationally by a process of mathematical formalization. In another, you describe two pieces, Vanitas and Impact, that record the impact of Bayer's fist acting like a meteorite rather than the impact of the meteorite itself. In your gloss, they record an idea evoked by an object, enacted by a body, recorded in a substrate. Finally, you state that to encounter such an absent object, at once nowhere and everywhere present, is to recognize it as both objective and constructed, as the mediation of a real existence irreducible to a subjective correlate. So when Deleuze defines disavowal as a process that consists in neutralizing the given, such that a new horizon opens up beyond the given and in place of it, I think this definition actually applies very well to what you see Bayer doing with this piece. It seems like a fetishistic project in the best, that is most Deleuzian sense of the term, right? In the terms of his analysis, I wonder whether we could describe Bayer as a photographer of primary nature, extracting and formalizing the primary or mathematical nature from the sensory qualities of the object. So I'll just conclude with three questions. One question concerns the place of Freud and of psychoanalysis more generally with respect to what you call rationalist empiricism. You know, I realize that psychoanalysis is not really central to your project, at least explicitly, but it seems to me that it's not entirely alien either. Could Freud, especially as Deleuze reads him here, be understood as engaging in a work of rational empiricism? Deleuze describes the beyond of the pleasure principle as a problem for transcendental philosophy, while Freud describes his own method as one of pure speculation. But from the vantage of your arguments, are either of these terms really appropriate? Right? So I'm thinking of precisely the way that you're wanting to question, transcendental philosophy and what you just said earlier. Second, to what extent do you think that the priority that Michel Henry gives to autoaffection and to the immediacy of experience really applies to psychoanalysis? Whether or not you agree with Deleuze's analysis in these examples, do you believe that there is something akin to techniques or the exteriorization of thought in psychoanalysis? Many philosophical readers of psychoanalysis ultimately align it with autoaffection, including some of the very best. Although I assume, as I mentioned earlier, that Derrida's argument in Freud and the Scene of Writing is influential for your own thinking about writing and techniques, I wonder whether you agree with his conclusion at the end of the essay, which is that Freud ultimately reabsorbs the techniques of writing into autoaffectivity and self-presence. Another example might be Catherine Malabou's claim in The New Wounded that psychoanalysis is inseparable from a certain autoaffectivity in as much as it relies upon a personal history or narrative. Finally, what significance does Deleuze have, if any, for your thinking about rationalist empiricism and speculative critique? Well, one certainly couldn't ask you to address a greater range of figures in the book than you already have. I'm curious as to why he's not central to your meditations, given what I at least perceive to be his important contributions to these questions. Thanks.
Thanks, and now we'll give Nathan time to respond.
Okay, well, thanks so much for both of these responses. I guess I'll get right to it. So I'm going to begin with Tracy's response and then come back to Alexi's response second. And I will say, I guess, in the case of both Tracy and Alexi, I mean, these are thinkers whose work I've been reading for a long time, and it's a little bit uncanny, I suppose, to experience their thinking directed at my own book. So it's a fascinating experience. So let me say, responding to Tracy. So first of all, I find this approach to Bachelard's formulation extremely interesting and productive. All the more so because, you know, you've pushed well beyond the level of attention that I devote to it in the book. I can say that it took quite a while before I really took seriously the specificity of Bachelard's analogy at all. Initially, I basically, you know, took it as a casual remark made in passing that nevertheless seemed like it could serve as a useful slogan for my project. And what I liked about it in particular is Bachelard's recognition of the strangeness of the bond between rationalism and empiricism. And I appreciate the foregrounding of this element of my approach by Alexi's paper. And it was also at issue in my earlier remarks about paradox. So what I focused on at first was that strangeness as the key to the analogy. And I think your paper nicely draws out the importance of defamiliarizing the bond between pleasure and pain, while also giving a technical, conceptually rigorous sense to that defamiliarization. It was only when I drew near the end of the book project, as I was writing the conclusion, that it occurred to me to force the issue of exactly what the bond between pleasure and pain is. That occurred to me, as you've noted, because I'd returned to thinking through the relation of Michel Henry's work to my project, which was also at issue right at the beginning of my research when I was writing that chapter, initially a conference paper on Descartes and Hume. And indeed, I think it was Rob who initially recommended that I read Henry's incredible chapter on Descartes in the genealogy of psychoanalysis. So even though I criticized that chapter, it's just an amazing piece of philosophy. So returning to what I then started thinking of as Bachelard's riddle, I thought of it as a way to formulate a kind of pithy answer to the question. That life constitutes the bond between pleasure and pain as the condition of all affectivity whatever, while technics, that which is not life, enables an exteriorization of thinking as well as capacities of receptivity that are exterior to living beings, and thus that technics might be thought as a strange bond between rationalism and empiricism, as strong as that between pleasure and pain. So 2 points in reply then concerning the two sides, the two elements of this strange analogy. So first, by positing life as an answer to the implicit question posed by Bachelard's formulation, what is the bond that unites pleasure and pain? I didn't mean to suggest that life thus makes it possible to identify pleasure and pain. Rather, what I mean to suggest is that, and actually I think you gave a good exposition of this, what I mean to suggest is that conceptualized as the condition of possibility for all affectivity whatever, and indeed as autoaffection itself, life constitutes the ground for the very existence of pleasure and pain. So pleasure and pain are not identical, though they may enter into complex relations of co-determination, but they are united in the more fundamental sense that they are affects at all. And indeed, the sense in which they're opposing affects might be conceptualized as determining certain limits or boundaries or polarities of affectivity. So what I mean is that the existence of life constitutes the common field wherein pleasure or pain can become manifest at all. And their unity, or the unity that one may think in that respect, is that of the common ground of their differential experience, or of the complex relations into which they enter. So considered from that perspective, which one might indeed call transcendental, we're close to the passage that you cite in Deleuze's reading of Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where, quote, a principle or law is that which governs a common field. So a second point then would be that technics is that which is exterior to life, and in Bernhard Stiegler's account, co-constitutive of the emergence of Dasein, that is, of ecstatical temporalization, and thereby also of what I call the retroaction of thought upon life, and the casting of thinking being beyond the field of living being. That technics considered in this sense is intimately bound up indeed with what Freud calls the death drive, something which you've encouraged me to start thinking through more closely. So technics occupies a strange position in the relation between matter, life, and thought. We can say that the existence of matter is a condition of possibility for the existence of life, and that the existence of life is a condition of possibility for the emergence of thought. But the coevolution of thinking and techniques, Stiegler's account, suggests the intimacy of what he calls organized inorganic matter to the development of the relation between life and thought, casting the psyche back, as it were, towards its origins in inorganic matter, just as it is also cast forward into the emergence of a new modality of existence, that is, thinking being. And I just want to pause here actually to say that that a former student of mine, David Rambo, who's here, is developing a theory of technology that complicates and I think will improve on Stiegler's inadequate definition of technology as organized inorganic matter, but that's just a little note I wanted to throw in. So formulating the death drive, Freud writes, here's my cat. Freud writes, if we are to take as a truth that knows no exception, that everything living dies for internal reasons, becomes inorganic once again, then we shall be compelled to say that the aim of all life is death. And looking backwards, that inanimate things existed before living ones, end quote. But the coevolution of the human and of technics complicates the commonality of what Freud refers to as all life by intervening through a division of living beings, attendant upon the emergence within the history of life of the strange creature that we are, the human animal. The technics cast life at once ahead of and behind itself. And this is the substance of Stiegler's argument defining technics as the essence of Dasein, saying that the essence of Dasein is indeed something technological. In Lacanian terms, the strangeness of the human animal as a speaking being, or par l'être, is that insofar as we are animals, we should simply be living beings, situated at the level of what Lacan calls the imaginary. Insofar as we're thinking beings and speaking beings, we should be, let's say, situated on the level of the symbolic. And the problem is that we can't simply be both living and thinking beings as if these could enter into harmony. We are both, but as if these could enter into harmony with one another. That is, as if the relation between life and thought did not occasion a certain dissonance or discomfiture, and indeed the ungrounding of the propriety to itself of either life or thought that is called the unconscious. And this ungrounding is thus constitutively related to technics, is that which intervenes within life as its exteriorization, producing an exteriority of thought to life in the very instance of the genesis of thinking. Technics is situated in the position of the real, I would say, as that which intervenes in the relation between the imaginary and the symbolic. And that's precisely the site of the strange bond between rationalism and empiricism, between reason and experience, the symbolic and the imaginary. And this is why I think that your suggestion that the fetish comes to occupy this place as what you call the technology of exteriorization is quite precise. And having read some of your work on libertinism and the relation between philosophical rationalism and Deleuze's book on masochism, it's fascinating to see that work intersect with my own project in this way, while also modifying it. So particularly, I think through this quite compelling, interesting claim that disavowal might be positioned as a bond not only between pleasure and pain, but also between rationalism and empiricism. So, I mean, I look forward to speaking more about these questions. More briefly, let me try to reply to your three questions as directly as possible. So first, what's the place of Freud and psychoanalysis with respect to rationalist empiricism? Well, I'm glad that you asked, because this is a question that I would have loved to take up in the book, and that I had to leave aside, though I'd like to take it up in the future, particularly because, you know, a number of us have this practice of reading Lacan's seminars every summer, and I'm constantly working on these questions and these materials. So for now, I can say that psychoanalysis is, like historical materialism, it seems to me a perfect example of the kind of disjunctive relation between reason and experience that I try to theorize. So consider the fact, for example, that Lacan constantly refers, on the one hand, to our experience. He uses this phrase again and again, specifying analytic practice as a unique field of experience constituted by the relation between analyst and analysand. And on the other hand, Lacan can declare formalization, that is our goal, our ideal. And here, in both of these formulations, the collective pronoun our designates the collective dimension of the psychoanalytic movement, of the Freudian field, and the very essence of that movement, I think, is the unpredictable relation between theory and practice. So like Marxism, psychoanalysis requires the systematic articulation of concepts put in place by Freud and developed by Lacan in particular, in order not to collapse back into ego psychology. But the initial development of those concepts and their successive waves of revision also rely upon a constant shuttling back and forth between theory and practice, reason and experience, between the formalization of concepts and the pressure of analytic experience upon those concepts. So Beyond the Pleasure Principle is, of course, a key text for thinking about this dialectic of theory and practice. And it's particularly telling that, you know, it's only really analysts who contribute to the revision of psychoanalytic theory. So I think this is a key sign that there's something particular going on, which is akin to the history of Marxist theory and psychoanalytic theory, that of course, all kinds of theoretical contributions enter into the field of those revisions made by non-analysts, but they're certainly driven by the relay between theory and practice that requires our experience as one of its poles. So second, to what extent does the priority of autoaffection and the immediacy of experience apply to psychoanalysis? Well, I would say if the question is the priority of autoaffection, well then, you know, not much, or not in too particular a way. I mean, so of course, autoaffection is constantly, is a condition of possibility for, and is constantly at issue in our subjective experience, in our embodied experience. And the primary value of Henri's work for me is that it gives an extremely rigorous philosophical definition of life, one of the few such definitions, I think, in the history of philosophy. But psychoanalysis is bound up with the disjunction and the uncanny relation between the imaginary and the symbolic, which Lacan tries to sustain. And I don't think that Lacan's topology, which I view as essential for analytic theory, can be sustained by, you know, obviously a theoretical construction like Henri's. More broadly, any reference to the immediacy of experience as the ground of psychoanalytic practice obviously has to be submitted to serious critique, since, you know, for example, the analytic practice of construction or the phenomenon of transference are essential to sustaining a Freudian orientation, and these can't be thought in terms of the immediacy of experience. And third, what significance does Deleuze have to my project? Well, Deleuze is an extremely important thinker for me, and the theory of the encounter developed in difference and repetition is crucial for my thinking about the rupture of experience, insofar as experience would be understood as the synthesis of the past and the future. Il y a dans le monde quelque chose qui force à penser, something in the world forces me to think. That there's, you know, this formula for the encounter in Deleuze has to do with a kind of rupturing of the continuity of experience. But Deleuze is a transcendental philosopher, what he calls transcendental empiricism, involves the transformation of Kant's theory of the conditions of all possible experience into a theory of the conditions of real experience. The construction of that theory is immensely complicated, and I can't possibly do it justice, but I can refer to a section of chapter 1 where I argue that Deleuze's theory of asymmetrical synthesis produces a concept of disparity as sufficient reason, and of the ground as the ground, what he calls the groundless ground, that undoes the principle of non-contradiction. But it's precisely, for me, a non-transcendental dialectical account of the relation between reason and experience that I'm interested in developing after Hegel. And the precise sense of that dialectic, I think, sustains the principle of non-contradiction through the movement of negation produced by contradictions. So this is something also that we could talk about more. Moving on now to Alexi's response. So I'm extremely grateful for this insightful reading of my book, which allows me to address, I think, a key question. How does my reading of the history of philosophy and the relation between philosophical systems motivate my engagement with the philosophical problem of the classical philosophical problem of the relation between contingency and necessity? So this is the question that I want to take up. And let me just say, I just want to make one remark. Concerning contingency, I mean, Alexi highlights the way in which this moves across different elements of my project and different chapters of the book. And I just want to make sure that, I note that I recognize the radically different levels of reflection upon which contingency applies to these different elements of the book project. So for example, historical in the case of Marx, or the ontic determination of the contingent predicates of objects, or even just the contingent existence of particular objects, but also the ontological dimension then that I try to theorize after Meillassoux of the necessity of contingency, which here specifies the very movement of the ontological difference from beings to being. So contingency applies to beings. The necessity of contingency is an ontological concept. Okay, so when we situate ourselves in relation to the history of philosophy, we inevitably do so through the mediation of a proper name. If this is inescapable, it's also unfortunate, insofar as it tends to obscure the more fundamental dimension of philosophical problems that traverse and are transformed by the philosophical systems of particular thinkers, and indeed that create those systems as much as they are produced by their authors. We might even say that they produce the authors themselves. If I distinguish between being and beings in terms of the ontological difference, this may be described as a Heideggerian position, as if the thinking of the ontological difference were reducible to allegiance to a particular thinker, and as if Heidegger were unambiguously the agent of the thinking that bears his name. The self-evidence of such common sense is exactly what philosophy should undo, and in fact, what it has undone. Even if we can hardly avoid reference to proper names, the point of philosophical labor is not to terminate its unfolding by endorsing once and for all a system sutured to a proper name, but rather to grasp the movement of thought as it passes through the development of conceptual problems, to clarify and elaborate the stakes of that movement in our own time, so as to understand its contours and grapple with its unrealized potential. Now, Kant's Proustian testimony suggests the involuntary nature of philosophical interpolation. Quote, "I openly confess that my remembering of David Hume was the very thing which many years ago first interrupted my dogmatic slumber and gave my investigations in the field of speculative philosophy a quite new direction." Kant describes that new direction as, quote, "the working out of Hume's problem in its widest extent, namely the critique of pure reason." It's a quotation from Kant. This is as much as to say that Hume's problem not only awakens Kant, but also works itself out through him as his book, as the theory of synthetic a priori judgments and the deduction of those categories which condition all possible experience. The remembrance of Hume's problem awakens Kant like a disturbing dream or a bump in the night, and the working out of that problem becomes the substance of his waking labor. It is interiorized and then possessed as what he calls my critique of pure reason. such that Kant can say, quote, "As soon as I had succeeded in solving Hume's problem, I could proceed safely, though slowly, to determine the whole sphere of pure reason completely and from universal principles in its boundaries as well as its contents." Hume's problem takes possession of Kant, yet the solution to that problem is Kant's own. This inversion, taking possession of the alterity of the problem by solving it, enables him to philosophize in his own name. Kant is the name of this inversion. Yet, at the end of his critical labor, in the third critique, in the critique of the teleological power of judgment, Hume's problem returns as if it did not quite recognize itself in Kant's solution, or as if that solution were itself a kind of sleep, indeed a forgetting of being. And I'm happy to explain what I mean by that in the Q&A if you'd like, from which it is just now reawakened. Here, Kant argues that in addition to, Kant argues that in addition to the universal laws of nature determined by the categories, we must also think a unified order of particular laws of nature beyond the determinations of the understanding, as Kant says, and that we must think these laws as necessary, even if we can never cognize them as such. For Kant, the necessary unity and harmony of laws beyond the determinations of the understanding, for that very reason, is a merely reflective judgment, a subjective principle, a maxim, through which we must proceed in reflections on the objects of nature. So Kant writes, "The understanding is, of course, in possession of a priori universal laws of nature, without which nature could never be an object of experience at all. But still, it requires, in addition, a certain order of nature in its particular laws, which can only be known to it empirically and which, from its point of view, are contingent. These rules, without which there would be no progress from the general analogy of a possible experience in general to the particular, it must indeed think as laws as necessary, because otherwise they would not constitute an order of nature, even though it does not and never can cognize or know their necessity." So the deduction of the categories of the understanding was supposed to solve Hume's problem by providing universal conditions of possibility for experience, to which any and all objects of experience must conform. But here we see that in addition to such universal conditions, we must also assume the necessary unity of particular laws that make such conformity possible. It's the argument. From the general to the particular, since otherwise there could be no order of nature. So Kant presents this as the deduction of a merely subjective principle, but it is in fact a disguised induction. Since there has been an order of nature, we must think the necessity of such rules in order for there to be an order of nature. But this is question begging with respect to Hume's problem, which demands to know by what right do we infer that the order of nature which has persisted in the past will continue to persist in the future? What is it that allows us to infer the continuity of an order of nature between the past and the present or the future? In response to this question, the question posed by Hume's problem, Kant concludes his critical system by announcing a reflective principle that amounts to a specimen of what I would call subjective dogmatism. He says, we must think the necessity of particular laws of nature beyond the determining power of our faculties, because that is necessary for there to be an order of nature that can come into conformity with our faculties. But it was exactly the justification for such a principle that acute man, David Hume, had asked for in the first place. What interests me here is not any supposed failure of Kant's critical system. Just as the remembrance of Hume gave Kant's investigations in the field of speculative philosophy a quite new direction, Kant reroutes the trajectory of modern philosophy in a manner that clarifies every major problem in the philosophical field. And the evidence of this is that he remains the single most important point of reference for such different thinkers as Hegel, Heidegger, and Deleuze. Thus, it's all the more significant that Quentin Meillassoux, in the wake of all these thinkers, should recognize that Hume's problem remains the name of that reconfiguration of modern philosophy, a fact affirmed by Kant himself in his own description of his project as the working out of Hume's problem in its widest extent, namely my critique of pure reason. Meillassoux' insight is that Kant's solution does not address Hume's problem in its widest extent, since Kant assumes, as in fact did Hume, that we must think the necessity of particular natural laws. It's Badiou's critique of the concept of nature itself through transfinite set theory that enables Meillassoux to reopen Hume's problem by refuting its probabilistic resolution, and thereby demonstrating that we do not have to think the necessity of natural laws in order to understand that there may be an order of nature without such necessity. That is, that such an order of nature could be contingent. Yet this is also an order which is exposed then to the contingency of becoming. In his doctoral dissertation, Meillassoux' precise question, which I think is a much more precise question than is posed in After Finitude, is whether we must think a becoming of laws in excess of the laws of becoming. Is there a becoming of laws? Must we think a becoming of laws in excess of the laws of becoming? His complex argument for the absolute status of contingency amounts to an argument for the absolute status of becoming. The stability of the laws of becoming is subject to a becoming of laws. Thus, he delivers a subtractive concept of the ontological difference. Beings are contingent. The being of beings, which itself is not a being, is the necessity of contingency. Contingency is ontic. The necessity of contingency is ontological. Meillassoux shows us what we do not have to think, that the laws of nature must be thought as necessary. And he shows us what we do have to think, that the contingency of beings must be thought as necessary, that there cannot be a necessary being, that contingency itself cannot be thought as contingent. To position this as a thinking of the ontological difference, as Meillassoux does in his dissertation, is to suture Badiou's transfinite deconstitution of the whole, of the concept of nature, which is what he does in Meditations 11 to 13, of being an event, to suture that deconstitution of the whole with Heidegger's thinking of being qua being as the pure exteriority of time, of temporality as, quote, the primordial outside of itself, in and for itself. The excess of becoming over the laws of becoming is the concept of the pure exteriority of time, a time of becoming unsubordinated to any given order of being, and a time exterior to the law-like synthesis of phenomenal presentation. Returning to Heidegger's thinking of the ontological difference through Badiou's deconstitution of the whole, Meillassoux turns his concept of the unsubordinated contingency of absolute time against Hegel's double annulment of time, at the end of the phenomenology and at the end of the logic, an annulment which depends, Meillassoux argues, on the alignment of the true with the whole. So this is an argument that I present in chapter 4 of the book. Moreover, through this complex operation upon and within the history of philosophy, Meillassoux returns us to the source of the problem of becoming in pre-Socratic thought. He argues that while Heraclitus thinks the eternal laws of becoming, thinks becoming as decay, it is Anaximander who thinks the concept of becoming as without law, quote, as an adikia from which nothing that is escapes. And I can't do justice here to the density of these conceptual relationships in this brief exposition, but what I'm trying to draw out is the transformation of a philosophical problem by the complex determinations of the history of philosophy, which one could trace in far greater detail with more time. So for example, through Althusser's underground current of the materialism of the encounter, or through the importance of Jean-René Verne's work on Descartes and Hume from Meillassoux. But My point is that we do not choose how to orient ourselves in thinking. That orientation is itself produced through encounters with mentors and friends, or with a history of philosophy that is neither learned all at once nor in sequential order. Insofar as we are attuned to philosophy at all, and why is that? We are captured by problems, possessed by questions, awoken by that which disturbs the dream of subjective autonomy, and by that which suddenly illuminates the benighted slumber of self-sufficiency. Kant remembers Hume. His remembrance of Hume befalls him and gives his investigations a quite new direction. Meillassoux can revive that problem, can show that it still agitates contemporary philosophy because of Badiou's demonstration of the ontological significance of transfinite mathematics. And this demonstration can then be turned back upon Heidegger, upon Hegel, upon Kant, upon Heraclitus and Anaximander in a manner both in keeping and quite at odds with the direction of Badiou's own thought. For my part, as I write in the introduction of my book, it was my obsession as a student with the problem of induction and its relation to the theory of primary qualities that attuned me to the questions that I would later encounter in After Finitude, and that would lead me to try to theorize a disjunctive relation between rationalism and empiricism, reopened by critiques of phenomenology and transcendental philosophy, stemming from certain philosophical circles in which I found myself situated. Any such formation, which every thinker undergoes in a different way, involves a complex relation between what has to be said and what happens in thought, a dialectical determination of the relation between rational constraint and empirical circumstance. The task and the chance of philosophy, as I understand it, is to awaken to the imperatives of that determination, to take seriously the problems it imposes, and to navigate their contours without giving way on either the risks of speculation or the rigors of critique. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so we have time for Q&A, and I'll invite people to respond to the topics that came up in this session, as well as anything left over from the previous session or anything pertaining to Nathan's book. I think probably the easiest way to do it is either just use the hand raise function or indicate that you have a question in the chat, and I'll try to keep track of it. So it looks like David Rambo has a question.
Yeah, hey, thank you. Thanks for the shout out, Nathan. I appreciate it. My question has nothing to do with Stiegler, however. It's coming from my kind of intractable Whiteheadian proclivities, but I'll try to avoid getting too far in the weeds because the risk of mentioning Whitehead is having to go into his entire system, which would be unnecessary for this kind of event. So I would just appreciate a clarification of the usage of the term law in this Meillassoux assertion that, and I'm quoting you on page 112, that absolute time submits the laws of becoming to the becoming of laws, right? So first, what is a physical law? And if there cannot be a necessary being, then how can the very notion of a physical law be maintained? And so what I would like to provoke is that we shouldn't do away with the notion of orders of nature, but rather ought we to dissociate the idea of an order of nature from the notion of physical laws? Because it seems to me that the idea of the becoming of laws, I prefer the way you just put it, the contingency of an order of nature ought to do away with the notion of physical laws. It does not make sense to me to continue to speak of physical laws as something that can be. As a figure of speech, sure. And really this is coming from my kind of allegiance to Whitehead's categorical schema. For him, there is no such thing ultimately a physical law. And indeed, for him, he goes further than Meillassoux already in saying, it's not that what exists may cease to exist. It's rather that what exists must cease to exist, right? This is the entire processual orientation. And so I mean, that's really, that encapsulates it. If you could say more beyond that, I'd be really interested to know whether you're amenable to saying that that there are laws of becoming, but that's precisely what speculative philosophy ought to construct. And they're not about any contingent determination of the empirical, but rather what must be thought about the becoming of the empirical, right? So like they're laws of becoming in the absolute speculative sense, rather than the sort of ontic determination that science discusses. So yeah, so what is physical law?
This is a great question. I would, first of all, I would recommend for anyone interested in the sort of like contemporary, relatively contemporary status of this question, Stephen Mumford's book, Laws in Nature. Mumford is, an analytic philosopher, but he takes up different positions on the question of physical law in some detail and works through them. And Mumford, as I do, I suppose, thinks of physical laws as regularities, laws in nature rather than laws of nature. And, Peirce wrote these fascinating, which I know you've read, David, speculative texts on the evolution of physical laws. But note that, so here's the question. If we can think of a becoming of regularities of nature that we can think of in terms of kind of like cosmological quasi-evolutionary process, evolutionary because let's say it involves variation, mutation, like et cetera, and the sort of like probabilistic, genesis of regularities through physical interactions. But nonetheless, the question remains, that sort of leaves open the question, well, what are the laws of that genesis itself? What are the laws of becoming? And are the laws of becoming themselves subject to a becoming of laws? And we can see that actually when philosophers address this question, they constantly push back the level of the laws that are being addressed. So for example, you can read about, the laws of complexity, which are developed to explain the disjunction between the laws of physics and the laws of biology, or how there can be an emergence of new orders of law within the order of laws of physics, which are consistent with the laws of physics, but nevertheless irreducible to them. So then you have to generate a new order of laws to think about that. Now, so the ontological question, so these are ontic questions. These are questions that are any question that, let's say, operates within the regularities of nature as they exist. These are scientific questions, which are then ontic questions. But the ontological question then bears upon the status in Meillassoux work, the modality of those laws themselves. So Kant aligns precisely in that discussion that I'm mentioning in his theory of teleological judgment, critique of teleological judgment. He aligns regularities with or necessity with laws. So when he says they must be necessary, he says, i.e. laws. Right? So the relation between the regularities of nature, the fact that they have to be thought as necessary, according to Kant, is the very concept under which they are thought as laws. And so the question is, there's no question of displacing the order of nature. This is the elegance of Meillassoux' displacement of probabilistic reasoning as it applies to the totality of nature. There is an order of nature. It's not the case that cinnabar is blue one second and red the next, in my experience. In the past, that has not been the case. There is an order of nature that for Kant has to be thought on the one hand through the regularities of the determinations of the understanding, and on the other hand through what he says must be thought a subjective principle of the necessity of particular laws that come into conformity with the regularities produced by the determinations of my faculties. That's the point of that subjective maxim. If Kant didn't need to say that, he wouldn't have to deduce, as he puts it, a subjective maxim, but he feels that he does. It goes beyond the laws of the understanding, which are supposed to answer Hume's question. And so then the question is it true? Do we have to think what Kant says we have to think? This is an open question. That is to say Kant's assumption, indeed, that we must think the necessity of regularities of nature for there to be an order of nature, that we have to think that the order of nature that we experience is necessary. This is what can be called into question. And this is, in Meillassoux work, the very substance of ontological reasoning. And so Meillassoux' answer to that question is complicated. I can get into it if people want, and the dissertation is very interesting and very different from After Finitude. But I would just say that, my concept of like physical laws is that they're not laws insofar as they're necessary. They're regularities of nature. And then the ontological question is, are the regularities of nature necessary or contingent? And they can still be regularities if they're contingent. That's the point of Meillassoux' demonstration. And that's why they don't defy reason. Or the necessity of contingency does not defy reason. Nor does it defy experience, for that matter. Yeah.
So I think, Aaron, you had your hand up, right?
Yeah. I just wanted to follow up on some of the, on the question that Tracy raised, the kind of what about psychoanalysis question. But I think Tracy raised a number of really interesting points. And, first off, I just have to say, as a testament to the kind of fecundity, the usefulness of your idea of rationalist empiricism, the more I think about it, I start kind of seeing it everywhere. It's starting to become a kind of filter through which I can kind of repose old problems and see them in a new way. And I think, a great example of this is precisely what Tracy raised, the Deleuze's analysis of the foundations, for example, of the pleasure principle. And I do think, like, Deleuze's analysis there in the second chapter of Difference and Repetition is much closer, actually, to the spirit of your book than your reference to Michel Henry. Why? Because what Deleuze does there is he runs the whole gamut from empiricism to rationalism in his explanation of the foundation of the pleasure principle. So he starts with,
right.
His argument is, just very simply put, his argument is the foundation of the pleasure principle can only be thought of in an empirical way via a thinker like Hume. But then it gets more complex when you introduce Bergson, still an empiricist, and Proust. But then the ultimate ground is the kind of the unground, but the ultimate ground of the pleasure principle is actually the rationalist tradition. And who does he turn to? Descartes, Kant, and then Hölderlin as the kind of ultimate rationalist. The ultimate idea of reason is a kind of madness. So you see there, so if I look at Deleuze now kind of retroactively from your perspective, what I would say is Deleuze's account of the foundation of the pleasure principle is a theory of rationalist empiricism, or at least it's a theory, it's a kind of thought that tries to think the bond between empiricism and rationalism. And I find that very interesting. And I think he makes it's a much better fit actually than Michel Henry there. But my other question would be, or maybe this is actually just a suggestion, but thinking about I think psychoanalysis could be thought very productively in this sort of the terms you lay out. And I would be tempted to just start very simply, without a very sophisticated reading of Lacan or anything, but I would just start off by saying, look, the unconscious is a rational concept. Like, you don't encounter the unconscious anywhere. There's no proof for it. All you encounter in life is some strange phenomena. Slips of the tongue, weird distortions. People behave in odd ways you can't really explain. But the unconscious is as Freud put it, and I think this is Freud's, very best formulation. I keep coming back to this. It's just a hypothesis. So it's just a rational hypothesis. It's even quite extravagant with respect to the empirical domain. It's just something I have to posit, and then I see what the consequences are.
Yeah.
Now, on the other hand, what Freud does is he develops, again, in your terms, he develops a specific techniques to access the domain of the unconscious. And the techniques is what fuses it to the empirical domain. And what is that techniques? It's free association. So he develops a very specific technology of speech. And the whole point of that technology, you know, is what? It's actually just to be able to listen to somebody. So his real question is, you know, what does it mean to actually hear somebody? And not that hearing being occulted by all sorts of preconceptions you have about psychology. So what does it mean really to just listen to somebody? And there you get your problem that you raised in the first session, which is that problem of encountering, how did you put it, the exteriority of being. How do you encounter the exteriority of being in terms of, you know, in terms of an empirical encounter, like with another person in an analytic setting? And the way to do that, the way of really encountering something exterior is via this technology of free association, which then confirms a hypothesis of reason, which is the unconscious. I don't know, that's my first, I was trying to rethink, you know, psychoanalysis in your terms, and I think that could work. Anyway, that's just my suggestion. But again, if I could say what I think, yeah, it's funny. It's funny that Tracy put so much emphasis on that quote, but of course that's how you open your book with the Bachelard. But if you go with the life answer of Henri, it's almost like you're saying the bond between empiricism and rationalism ultimately is an empiricism, because that's how I read Henri, that ultimately it's about finding that bond in something I immediately intuit in my sensation. Whereas Deleuze would say that bond has to be thought itself as the link between empiricism and rationalism. You know, it's a much nicer reflexive.
Yeah. So let me just respond to the last point, and then it's a bit of a that's not quite how what I say is that life is the bond between pleasure and pain, not that life is the bond between rationalism and empiricism.
Oh, I understand that, yeah.
Right. Technics is the bond between rationalism and empiricism, which is as strong as. And again, I appreciate Tracy's, you know, complication of this reading. So a couple things. First, psychoanalysis, then more briefly, maybe Deleuze. I mean, you left out Nietzsche. You know, the three syntheses of time, I mean, Hume, Bergson, and then the eternal return, which he thinks in relation to.
Nietzsche's not in that chapter.
Is not in that chapter. Okay, so I'm just like projecting Nietzsche back on the three syntheses of time, which I'm perfectly happy to do because I think it's absolutely essential to thinking. Actually,
no, but okay, you're right. I mean, it is essential to the
But so I would just say that with respect to psychoanalysis, I mean, first of all, in terms of the setup, let me make 2 points. The setup of the psychoanalytic situation, you know, it's not just that one could say in a banal way that the couch is a technology or something, which is true actually, but more importantly, you know, I'm really dogmatic about, not that I'm an analyst, so who am I to say, but if I were, I would make sure that I had my chair set up at a 90-degree angle, exactly perpendicular to the couch. I seriously think that this is extremely important. And you can see in the photos of both Freud's office in Vienna and in London that the chair is perpendicular to, is 90 degrees to the couch. And this is rarely the case, I think, in the photos one sees of analyst's office. But I think it's actually quite important that there's a completely, like, there's an intersection and a radically different, you know, directionality in the field of the situation of speech. This, I think, really matters, actually. But let me say something about exteriority, because I don't want this to become like a word that is simply thrown around. So let me distinguish between different ways of thinking, but again, different levels of reflection for understanding the notion of exteriority. So one of these would be the exteriority, let's say, of the future to a synthesis with the past. That's a kind of technical concept of, well, not as technical as Badiou's, but it's a concept of the event. Badiou, you know, that there's a rupture, that there's a break between the synthesis of experience, or even like a kind of historical, one might say, synthesis in the field of history between the past and the future. That's why I read Badiou with Hume in the mode of chapter 7. Secondly, I would say there's a displacement of the faculties of human faculties by instruments, by technology, that enables an exteriority of receptivity to to intuition and the synthesis of intuitions with concepts. That would be the point of the technological setup of scientific experimental situations. So that's different than, let's say, the wax experiment. That's different than like the psychoanalytic sofa, for sure, you know. Another form of exteriority, which requires, let's say, ontological reflection, is the exteriority of being to thinking, which doesn't mean that thinking is not situated within being, right? But that there's an asymmetrical relationship between being and thinking. There can't be an identity of being and thinking. There's an exteriority of being to thinking, which exceeds, you know, thinking being. And finally, the exteriority of time in Heidegger's sense, which I try to radicalize and which I think Meillassoux tries to radicalize. And it's the very crux of the reading of being and time. What does it mean to say that temporality is the primordial outside of itself, in and for itself? As Alexi mentions here, we're at the very limits of the existential analytic. And indeed, I think we go beyond the limits of the existential analytic. And that's why I think, you know, my reading of Heidegger is that although being and time is incomplete, and we can fill that in through the book on Kant and through the, you know, problems of phenomenology, like, I think nevertheless he achieves, you know, the thinking of the relation between being and time through a concept of time generated through the existential analytic, but in excess of it as absolute exteriority. And that's a properly ontological concept of time, which is irreducible to the phenomenological time of temporalization, the primordial outside of itself, in and for itself. That exteriority is the condition of possibility for the exteriority of temporalization understood in a phenomenological sense. And that's the challenge to Kant's understanding of the imagination, the foreclosure of the ungrounding of transcendental apperception. That's Heidegger's critique of Kant. It's taken up by Deleuze, it's taken up by Meillassoux, and for me, I think it's extreme. You know, I think Heidegger is right, and this is a serious way in which transcendental phenomenology, transcendental critique is ungrounded by post-Heideggerian reflection. So I just wanted to specify those different kinds of exteriorities so they don't get like collapsed into one another in a meaningless way. Finally, Deleuze. I mean, I don't have much more to say, I guess. You know, I love Deleuze. I don't think that what I'm interested in, how to put it, you know, it's hard actually to explain. It's the openness of the relation between reason and experience, and the sort of concatenated process of the critique of those two by one another that matters to me. And I don't see that in the development of a transcendental theory of the conditions of real experience. So I think that if I could categorize transcendental philosophy, it would be that it tries to theorize, let's say, conditions of possibility once and for all. And what I think is constitutive of what I'm calling rationalist empiricism is an open process. For example, one can say that technological conditions of receptivity are transcendental. The receptive capacities of any technology are a condition of possibility for its modification of the givenness of experience. However, the development of technology is historical. So those conditions of possibility are always changing. They are ungrounded in that sense. And one cannot give a transcendental theory of technological conditions of possibility. That's why Kant has to subtract the unity of apperception from time. That is the reason why that deduction is necessary. And so the ungrounding of the transcendental unity of apperception by time situates it in the history of evolution, in the history in history. And its exteriorization by techniques, the throwing outside of itself of thought in its first instance, which is what Stiegler tries to think, then allows us to think this strange dialectic of the development of thinking and technical capacities, which in my opinion can't be given a transcendental account of because it's ungrounded and historically sort of recursive and open. So that's the way that I hope that doesn't seem trivial. You know, I think it's extremely important, that distinction between transcendental philosophy and that way of thinking about the relationship between reason and experience is ungrounded.
Are there any other questions? Yeah, Amanda.
Maybe I can maybe take the occasion to pose a question. Or did somebody else have a question?
I think Amanda did, but you can...
Okay, yeah,
Okay.
well, I'll just
Okay, well, we can probably both pose them, but I just had a quick question. Could you say more about techniques? I mean, we were talking about techniques in terms of the couch. Is there a specific reference point that might be helpful to, I mean, is it techne in a more general sense, or what do you mean by techniques, Nathan?
Well, I basically, it's interesting because David Rambo, who I mentioned, was asking me this the other day, and my response is that this is a little bit like a conversation I have with Rob sometimes, or like Rob thinks it's important to answer the question, what is literature? And I don't, whereas I think it's very important to answer the question, what is being, but I don't think it's that important to answer the question, what is literature? Because I think that is to say, because I think it's an open question. And in this way, I don't really understand myself in this way, actually. And so what I said to David is like, well, it's just a sort of peculiarity. It seems odd for me that, I don't really seem to care that much what technology is at the level of giving a definition of it. But I think that, so if you describe it as an organized inorganic being, this is it's too indeterminate. It's like trying to give a definition of matter, actually, where it's just like, the question actually has to remain open in order for there to be materialism at all. But I think that, what interests me about Stiegler's critique is, first of all, that he intervenes in this, history of thinking about this problem that runs from Husserl and Heidegger through Derrida to his own work in a very complicated way. And, Derrida's introduction to the origin of geometry is extremely important for me. I talk about it a little bit in the chapter on Plato. But Stiegler, so what he thinks of, basically, one could say that like the capacity for exteriorizing thinking is constitutive of understanding technology. But on the other hand, technology is constitutive of understanding the genesis of thinking. And this is why, he calls it the fault of Epimetheus, the default of origin. And he thinks of it as a kind of a coevolution, but one which can't be thought in terms of the concept of origin. And so there's a constitutive relation in his thinking between the exteriority of time, throne projection, and the exteriorizing force of techniques. Which then Derrida in the Freud essay that Tracy's asking after, he refers to like polemics on the threshold of perception, because Derrida thinks of like neuronal processes in terms of writing. So there we have like a concept of inscription which goes like well beyond prosthesis. To thinking about like, a properly philosophical concept of writing, which involves like thinking about the sort of technicity of any capacity for receptivity at all. And I'm not sure that's like, I would want to go there. But the exteriorization of thinking through inscriptions, and Stiegler's argument is what opens up the capacity for anticipation and this sort of economy of the relationship between anticipation and memory. And, although, as I've said before, like, I don't like, I haven't, let's say, gained that much from reading a lot of Stiegler's other works, but I do think that Volume 1 of Techniques in Time is an extremely important work of philosophy, because it really takes up in a rich way this whole tradition. But I think it's, I think the question of exteriorization, the question of the relation between inscription and thinking, is what gives us a way. So the couch in a banal sense is like, it's a technology insofar as, let's say, it configures the body in a particular way while it's speaking. It's sort of used as a kind of technology by Freud. That's what's sort of interesting. So technology also has this kind of banal, pragmatic element of being defined in terms of use. And, I think actually that's quite important. Alexi, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'll try to be quick, maybe, because I see that there's also other questions. But I guess maybe I kind of want to maybe I can repose some of what I was doing in the form of a question, and that would be, in particular, I guess, what I was struck about by the way in which the importance that you stress in Meillassoux, in the way in which he wants to preserve the principle of non-contradiction, but call into question the principle of sufficient reason. If we read that back into this Hume-Kant encounter, which is what I was suggesting is the genesis of a kind of fundamental rupture, which is fascinating. Sort of approaching that encounter through the problem of your book allowed me to pose this as, in some sense, maybe the event of what critique is. And it's precisely the identity of the principle of non-contradiction and the principle of ground, which Leibniz is the first one to try to pose. In other words, that there has to be not only the principle of non-contradiction, but that itself requires this other formulation of a principle that had been unthought, prior to Leibniz, implicit. And what's fascinating then is that actually Kant maintain what he thinks Hume shows him is that actually the problem of metaphysics, has to be rethought in light of the problem of ground, not the problem of non-contradiction, precisely because, dogmatic metaphysics is perfectly consistent on, it doesn't fall into contradiction, but it's without ground. And there's a tendency in the book which you want to say, I want to preserve the principle of non-contradiction. But these other principles, so like the principle of non-contradiction itself is, anhypothetical insofar as it can only be proven through its own performative impossibility. It's self-refuting in the same way that you claim, not you claim, but Meillassoux also claims is the principle of factuality. But it's interesting that for Meillassoux, they can't be unified. Right, that you actually need two principles. And it seems like there's a kind of then, I guess maybe where I was going with the reading that I was developing would be that it seems like the principle of factuality is necessary precisely in order to prevent the principle of non-contradiction becoming a problem of ground, right? And it's interesting that in the passage that you cited in addressing Tracy's question, where actually, Deleuze in that passage sort of, says we need to reject the principle of non-contradiction and rethink and maintain a rethinking or transformation of the problem of ground as a rethinking of the principle of sufficient reason. So I guess what is at stake for you then in precisely this sort of rejection? Because if I understood, you sort of responded to some of the questions, or to my intervention by turning to the third critique. But in some sense, right, this is Kant's, the reassertion of teleology is, he thinks that there's some reason that we still need the problem of ground in order for reason to desire at all, right? Otherwise, there wouldn't be a problem of why it is that we desire to know, right? Even if, we cannot, and it seems like you want to call into question that the principle of ground in a radical way. And maybe I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, it's been an interesting experience working on this book because, let's say I know a lot of people who relate to the sort of conjuncture that I've referred to before as a sort of like, the point from which this project developed out of. I know a lot of people who regard these questions in a lot of different ways, and it's been interesting to see like what people are willing to think about or consider and what they're not. and what I'm willing to think about and consider and what I'm not as well, you know, but okay, so, and let me just say, I'm willing to stay over time as long as people want, and also whenever people want to go, please feel free. It's not like you have to stay, but you know, these are complicated questions, so I have to try to, I mean, okay. An anhypothetical demonstration, you know, refers to a demonstration wherein anyone who wants to refute, to reject what is demonstrated must refute themselves. So when Meillassoux so I think Meillassoux right. You know, actually, I think that Meillassoux opens up an extremely interesting, you know, modality of ontological thought in the dissertation. And he's done himself a lot of harm, you know, by this kind of like terminological schwärmerei in After Finitude, you know, which is more like the way in which Deleuze in a certain way has done himself a lot of harm, you know, the reference, for example, to hyperchaos, etc. In the dissertation, you know, the demonstration is just one can argue with it, but one cannot, you know, deny the sort of classical philosophical elegance of the mode of thinking that's deployed in this demonstration, which I translated in Parisia. And it's, you know, and so the point of it is like, if we're not going to set out from axioms, and this is also like extremely interesting, that if you want to say, you know, like Spinoza, everything is necessary, then you have to, then Spinoza sets out from axioms that allows him to establish the unbelievably powerful coherence of his thinking, you know, of what that means through his concept of substance. But the definitions to which the axioms are attached are contingent definitions. In fact, one has to like think about them. Must we think substance in that way, et cetera? And actually, they're closely connected to the history of the concept of the infinite, which is why Badiou's intervention in the history of philosophy is so important. You know, that if we open up the detachment, the desuturing of the infinite from the whole and from the one, then one changes the very grounds of a lot of those definitions that you know, motivate the conceptual developments of modern philosophy. So what does it mean for there to be an order of nature? What does nature mean, et cetera? These are all questions that are bound up with the relation between the infinite and the whole. And Badiou shows that, I mean, in an extraordinary way that really develops the significance of transfinite mathematics for philosophical concepts. So axioms are contingent. If you want to, you know, demonstrate, if you want to just say, this is, no, you can say it's contingent, but I say it's necessary. That itself is contingent. And you have to be able to demonstrate that somehow your axioms are not contingent. And the problem is you can't. And so Meillassoux, the interesting thing in the dissertation is he starts out and he just says, okay, there's the given. What we encounter is empirical givenness. What we encounter is the contingency of particular beings. They do not have to be, they're finite, etc. We encounter finitude. How are we in this situation to arrive at any necessary statement whatsoever if philosophy is necessary discursivity? And then the answer is to interrogate the contingency itself, the concept of contingency. If everything that presents itself to me is contingent, what is it that I can say is not contingent, such that I can reason necessarily? And the answer is contingency itself, because you cannot say contingency is contingent, et cetera. It just displaces the statement, in the way that you say generates a kind of nonsense. And it generates a kind of an auto-contradiction that then forces one, as you point out, one cannot disprove the principle of non-contradiction on pain of its reimposition. And he applies that thinking to the concept of contingency. And then he derives, you know, principles from saying, I cannot say that contingency is contingent. Therefore, I cannot think coherently that contingency is contingent, so I must say contingency is necessary. He derives what has to be said from what cannot be said. but he isolates the question of what is it that's worth interrogating in precisely this way in an extremely, rigorous fashion. And so, and then this opens up the question of becoming and the question of its relation to the exteriority of time in a way that is in line with the development of modern philosophy from Kant through Heidegger, even though it also opens it up and reroutes it in an important way. So I agree with you that, these famous statements by Kant, from the Prolegomena, they're extremely striking about Hume, and I take them extremely seriously. That Hume's problem is the problem of the critique of pure reason, and that the critique of pure reason is the working out of Hume's problem. And what's interesting about Hume's problem is that it's not just an empiricist problem. It's the question of the problem of induction is, do we have a rational or an empirical reason to say that the future must continue to resemble the past, that there's an order of nature that is necessary, between the past and the future? And so the reason I go to the critique of teleological judgment, it's in the introduction to the book. It's not just in my remarks today, that section. It's because it doesn't occur to Kant, I would say. It actually, I think, does not occur to Kant, just as it does not occur to Hume, that there could be an order of nature without it being necessary for us to think that order of nature as like governed by necessary laws. Because as the Cinnabar example shows, he's like, well, then why not? Why would it not be in flux? So the demonstration, through Badiou and this refutation of probabilistic reasoning is to show that it doesn't matter if it seems improbable, that there happens to be an order of nature that could change. One cannot, in fact, rationally sustain that position in the situation of transfinite mathematics, that is to say, a theory of being that Badiou opens up. So I just think that if one wants to take a position on this question, one has to follow it through these determinations and the relation between Badiou and Meillassoux in a serious way, and not just sort of dismiss this as like, oh, it's weird to think that, the laws of nature could change. I mean, this is totally insufficient. And if one goes into, the modality of reasoning in the dissertation, well, you see that you're dealing with a philosopher of the very first order. And the dissertation, is, although I disagree with the third part of it, I mean, it's an extraordinary text and I wish it could be translated in full.
So I think we have Jess and then Brendan, and then I have put myself on the list. And it's after 5, but, I mean, if anyone needs to leave, that's fine. Otherwise, as Nathan said, we can keep going, I think.
Rob, do you or Brendan need to leave? Because I can also stick around if one of you. Okay, yeah. I mean, I think I can ask a short question. I mean, I don't know how long the answer would be, but I think it goes back to the discussion we were having about technics and about your sort of open non-essentialist definition of technics. And I think I'm bringing it up because I was interested in hearing more, especially about your critique of the non-metaphysical reading of Hegel that you distance yourself from. So of course, the Brandom, Pinkard, Pippin reading of Hegel. And I guess the easiest way to put the question is something like, for you, Nathan, it is something like the space of reasons or the space of norms or something. Could that be a technology? I mean, is that a version of technics? Because I mean, one with, right there, I mean, our thoughts are sort of externalized. They're a kind of tool that we use to sort of guide scientific practice and guide our own way of making the world intelligible. And so if that's so, if you would characterize, say, the space of reasons or the normative games that we play with one another as a technology, does that put you closer to the Brandon Pippin version of Hegel than you are in the book, I guess? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I mean, I don't think that we should think about thinking itself as a technology. I think that it just sort of like hollows out the concept of technology. I think we should think about technology in terms of a prosthetic exteriorization of thinking, which undergoes a co-evolution with thinking such that the two of them can't be strictly separated, but they're certainly not identical, such that we can just say my thought is a technology, or my categories in a Kantian sense are technologies insofar as they govern my determination of experience. So no, but the simplest way to put my disagreement with these readings. So first of all, I don't think we play normative games with each other. I mean, and on this point, I'm a Kantian. Normativity is like, what must I do? And that's not a game. On the contrary, it's not a question of what I want to do. It's a question of what must I do. So I don't think I don't accept this Wittgensteinian language of games at all. I don't think philosophy is a game. I don't think language is a game. I don't think normativity is a game. Although it has rules, that doesn't mean that it's a game. But with respect to this, the non-metaphysical reading of Hegel, the key point for me is the distinction between immanent critique and transcendental critique. And I don't understand why, philosophers don't take this seriously when they read Hegel. So Robert Pippin, at the beginning of his recent book in the Logic, he just says, well, it's uncontroversial. He doesn't even think about it. It's uncontroversial that Hegel's logic is an a priori investigation. Well, Hegel precisely says it is not an a priori investigation. It cannot be understood through the opposition between the a priori and the a posteriori. It's a very important statement for me for thinking about rationalist empiricism. Precisely the way in which it is paradoxical insofar as it refuses this, let's say, conventional separation of the a priori and the a posteriori, where the whole point of that is that there's a dialectical relation between the experience of thinking and the necessity of thinking. And that's what Hegel tries to unfold, such that immanent critique involves the negation of thinking by its own becoming and its own contradictions, and which is productive. And so there's not even an attempt to take this into account in these readings of Hegel, which simply impose a transcendental framework on the reading of Hegel. And this is the way in which they try to save Hegel from I know not what. What they try to save Hegel for is the standards of common sense that govern Anglo-American analytic philosophy. And it is a disaster because Hegel is in no way a philosopher who would ever accept such criteria for thinking or such a disposition in thinking. So for me, I actually get a little upset about it, as you probably know, because it's like the attempt is to save Hegel, but to save Hegel for who? Not to save Hegel for philosophy, but to save Hegel for the destitution of philosophy. And I regard that as a kind of methodological war played out at the level of institutions, played out at the level of money, of funding, of dissertation projects, et cetera, just like psychoanalysis. And for me, there's no compromise. So everything has to do with the relationship between transcendental critique and immanent critique. That's where I would separate the disjunction. Because immanent critique, it refuses, as Alexi says, to foreclose the possibilities of thinking in advance. What's crucial to the determinacy of thinking, the content, to determinate negation and the production of content, the experience of thinking, is the openness of philosophical reflection. And that's also why I then reject the sort of adequation of immanent critique with the concept of the whole in Hegel, not for reasons that it's like, I don't know what, like totalitarian or bad or something, but because it's epistemologically incoherent within the terms of immanent critique. But thank you for your question. I don't mean to like freak out.
No, I'm not Robert Pippin. But I wish I were, but yeah. Okay, thanks, Nathan.
Yeah.
Okay, so Brendan and then me.
Yeah, thank you. I have another question along the lines of the technics discussion. So if I understand it correctly, techniques, pretty simply, the relationship between the proper use of a technology and a science. You need some kind of knowledge of the field, like for a telescope, you need enough knowledge of the night sky to know what you're looking at, to disclose more knowledge about the night sky. And then likewise, you need to know enough about the telescope itself to make sure you're looking out the right end. But there's not like a one-to-one relationship between technologies and their use for a science. Like with a few tweaks, you can easily take a telescope and use it for navigating on the sea. In the case of the human sciences, what are your examples of like writing, or more specifically, the arrangement of the couch and the armchair in the analyst's office? How are those like specific techniques for like human science, and what does that kind of unveil about how we disclose knowledge of like the field of words for psychoanalysis?
Okay, yeah, interesting question. I mean, for me, these are radically different situations, so which I don't want to conflate at all. And again, when I say, the description of the couch as a technology, I think is sort of banal and unnecessary, but it is possible to think about, again, like the positioning of the situation in this way, like, kind of what is in fact a kind of experimental setup by Freud, but that in no way gets us to the level at which empirical practices are played out in the physical sciences. So, so first of all, in order to think about the difference, so the chapter on the redefinition of the kilogram in the book would be the key chapter for thinking about how I try to think through experimental apparatuses and their relationship to formalizations. And as you point out, it's very important actually that what you're saying about the telescope. There's a kind of techne, which is not necessarily technological, that also has to accompany the use of technologies. And indeed, there's definitely a scientific dimension of imagination. So for example, when scientists try to determine like the structure of a complex molecule, they're like imagining the possible structures of the molecule and their mathematical configurations and the constraints that are applied, et cetera. But just the key point for me is that there's a level at which, for example, in the use of a Watt balance, where one, correlates the value of the Planck constant to the mass of a prototyped kilogram, and thereby establishes a relation between mass and energy, which can be used to first measure the Planck constant and redefine the kilogram on that basis. This sort of recursive practice requires an apparatus, and it requires extremely complicated mathematical formalisms that are radically historical in their development, but that then require the development of experimental apparatuses which filter out phenomenal immediacy, which have different conditions of givenness that are exterior to our cognitive faculties. And and those become the coordination of those with mathematical formalisms without them passing through the imagination in that experimental setup of the physical sciences is just extremely important. I don't think there can be, experimentation in the rigorous sense of the development of physics without that. In the human sciences, I don't know. To tell you the truth, I haven't thought that much about the question of. I like to use my fountain pen, more than my laptop, but I don't really think, I think that the theory of writing, is just so, the analysis of writing as a kind of technology, is constitutive of the development of this whole line of thinking, which runs through Derrida and Stiegler, among others, which I find extremely productive. But I don't, in no sense do I think that a sensibilist sofa is the same as an experimental apparatus in the sciences.
Okay, so I guess I'll pose my question. I actually have a question, and I promise that this is relevant to the discussion. Don't worry. But pertaining to your reference to our arguments about I think you said that you're interested in the question of being, versus the question of, what literature is, right? And it's, I realize I'm just aware of it sounding like such a dilettante or something, and that like you're thinking about being. And anyway, but what I was wondering, I was actually thinking about the discussion of Bayer in the book, whether you'd say that that there is sort of for you sort of I guess a specificity of art, which isn't the same as posing this question, what is literature or something. So what I'm thinking of is for Badiou, for example, I mean, there's certainly a specificity of art. So in aesthetics, I mean, the specificity of art is bound up with the demonstration of the untruth of the sensible qua sensible. So he has, all of the stuff about purification in there. And I think in Badiou's, philosophy proper, it's kind of harnessed to this more vague notion of creativity, in the same sense that politics is bound up with the for all, or love is bound up with this thought of non-relation. So there's something that there's something specific that sort of covers art, or that art makes manifest. And obviously, I mean, this is
yeah, keep going.
Oh, okay. I thought you were other people taking off. I appreciate that you're waving at me to stop. Okay, so and this is, I mean, would be completely different from attempting to provide a definition of painting that covers transhistorically all paintings and only paintings, which would be antithetical to Badiou's project. Say, I mean, in the same way as trying to like determine the possibility of Mallarmé from like the perspective of Racine or something like that, which is why I assume the question what is literature, I mean, insofar as it closes off these sorts of possibilities of new works, is why you'd reject the question in that sense. But I'm sort of wondering if I mean, since you do turn to a work of art in the book, I mean, is there for you a specificity of art that could be named, or is it something where there is only artworks, right? Which would be kind of like reduce it to this more empirical question.
Well, I mean, probably unfortunately for me, in most conversations I'm going to have, as I think I mean, don't you know, Rob, that I've simply come to accept your definition of art? I mean, that's literally true. I mean, you actually have like convinced me that the extension of Kant's theory of the, along with Dedeuve, that the extension of Kant's theory of the beautiful, that is to say, the singularity of a reflexive experience of phenomenal presentation correlated to mere form, that also provides in an expanded sense a way of thinking about art. That is to say, I mean, but the okay, so then yes, so the difficulty which we've discussed many times is that, of course, Kant's theory of, so it is a difficulty actually. So Kant's theory of the beautiful is obviously not just a theory of art. It's a theory of beauty and nature, et cetera. So aesthetic experience, the production of aesthetic experience then on Kantian terms is not adequate to define the work of art. Although we could say that it's maybe necessary, but not sufficient. And on those grounds, then I would have to say that, so then, I find Adorno extremely helpful in this respect for taking up then a theory of, and this bears upon conversations that I've also had with Audrey, for taking up a theory of the artwork as the sort of irreducibility of the object to, let's say, orders of causality exterior to the immanence of its form. That is to say, what the object is has to be considered in terms that mean it's not an object, but rather a work of art. And also Alexi, has written some incredible pages on this question in his book with respect to the ready-made. And de Deuve again is important here. But so there's a relay between an object that is not an object, but is rather a work of art. And in the case of the ready-made, also not, a work of art, but just art. And it's the peculiarity and the irreversibility, the sort of like strange irreducibility of the object to its objectness, which relies upon reflexive judgment for sure. And so I would just say that the mediating work of form is then crucial for distinguishing the work of art in the singularity of aesthetic experience from the presentation of the beautiful in nature. And I think the way that I would try to think about this is through the relation between Kant and Adorno. And I Adorno's sort of dialectical way of thinking about the formal constitution of the artwork and the irreducibility of the autonomy of the artwork due to its formal organization and its relationship then to aesthetic receptivity, to reflexive judgment, I think is absolutely crucial. But so then you can see, these are the most general definitions one could possibly have. And I think that's extremely important, because as soon as you try to make a definition of art more particular than that, which let's say certain versions of a kind of vulgar historical materialist, a non-dialectical, a sort of bad historical materialist version of art will be like, oh, art is institutional, et cetera. Yeah, for sure. But that's not sufficient, to think what happens in the relay between form and receptivity. And that's the core, I think, of. So, but you've as I said the other day in a talk, you've taught me more about this than reading anything but Kant and Adorno. So, that's
well, thank you. And I wasn't trying to hijack anything. I was like, yeah.
That's how I think about it. Yeah.
All right. Well, is there a last question? Are we?
And I also just want to say, in terms of critique, let me just say finally then, Rob and I have actually shouted at each other about these things, and so what's great, but that's not so the rigor of philosophical contestation, I think in a sense is just also has to remain open, and you don't know what will happen. And the conjunctural aspect of philosophical thinking, I think is part of what this project tries to remain open to in an Althusserian way in terms of the Kampfplatz, of philosophy. And I think the sort of geniality, the sociality of philosophy is irrevocably combined with ferocious contestation. So I also just wanted to say that by way of, a conclusion.
So yeah, thanks so much. Thanks to everyone. All of the respondents, some of who have survived everything. So others have kind of peeled off along the way. I think a special thanks to everybody from from Europe, where it's God knows what power, and and this was terrific. Thanks so much, for Nathan for writing such a great book. So
thanks so much. Thanks for coming. Yeah.